So season 21 for Apex Ranked is probably one of the hardest seasons of Ranked we have ever seen. And then throwing solo queue on top of that makes it even harder, which we all know was harder to begin with either way. And I feel like which legend you choose actually is going to have a big impact on how your solo queue experience is going to go. And I feel not many people have made guides with the solo queue experience in mind, or tier list for that matter. So with that being said, I'm going to rank every legend for gaining RP with solo queue in mind. I will also be ranking them with a tier list that goes from S all the way to E, with a total of 6 different tiers. Just know before we go any further, a lot of the time, the legend that you play the best with will be the legend that you should play. So say I put Bangalore in F tier, but you're a really good Bangalore. Just because she's in a low tier does not mean that you should not play her in ranked. You just may be making her life harder. Of course, that was just an example. We all know Bangalore's not bad. So starting off, as always, I am going to go through the legends based on what class they are in, and I am going to start with the Assault class. And our first legend in the Assault class is Bangalore. Now, if you've been playing the game pretty much at all recently, then this is probably no shock that I'm going to put Bangalore in A tier, and say that there is very few legends that I would say would beat Bangalore in terms of solo queue ranked. Even ignoring her ultimate, her smokes alone give you so much versatility in her kit, with being able to use them defensively, for resetting, for pushing, for running away. I mean, really what you can do with smokes is kind of endless in Apex. Pair that with her passive that lets you move 30% quicker when you're getting shot at, whether that be mid-fight to make you harder to hit, or running away and making it harder for people to catch up to you. Her passive and tactical alone just have such great synergy, and all-arounder, just a versatile kit in general. And then on top of that, her ultimate is great for pushing and great for running away, or if you need, you can use it just to stall a team pushing you. Honestly, you really can't go wrong with Bangalore. Next on this list, we got Fuse, who is going into C tier. Now, I honestly think Fuse is a good legend, and if you played him with the right team, he would be a very solid pick for ranked. The problem is with solo queue, I think survivability is the #1 most important thing you want to get out of a legend, and Fuse doesn't really have that anywhere at all in his kit. The reason why I even gave him a tier that's above the bottom ones is just because he has good potential to poke people without committing to a fight with the knuckle clusters and the ult. So in a sense, you can kind of third-party fights without even ever committing to him. He's not a bad legend, but for the sake of solo queue, I personally would not recommend playing him. But you could definitely make it work. Next, we have Ashe, who I ended up putting in C tier as well with Fuse. And honestly, it's mainly just because Ashe's tethers still really don't feel that good. After the addition of perks to the game, I actually don't mind her tethers now, and I think they're pretty solid. But the problem is her distance on her portal is still way too small, and then on top of that, enemies could take it at the same time, so it's not their greatest tool at getting away. And I feel it also just doesn't even go far enough to really make it a good gap closer. And that's why we're putting her in C. I do think she's a good legend, but I think some slight changes to the numbers she has would make her way better. Moving on to Mad Maggie, yet again another Assault legend who ended up in C tier. And the reason why I'm doing C tier and not lower is because I do think Maggie is a really good character, but she's kind of better if you have an actually solid team. But even solo queue, if you're someone who likes to actually commit to your fights, then her offensive power is really hard to beat up close. Her riot drill making certain angles unplayable, and then the ball just being absolutely obnoxious to be hit by, and the fact it can hit multiple people now. I think in terms of building fights, she's probably the best legend in the entire game. I would just argue that she is probably a little more team oriented, and her lack of a real getaway ability is what kind of holds her back in terms of being a solo queue player. But if you're a Mad Maggie main, you could definitely make this work. And now our last legend for the Assault class, and I'm sorry to the Ballistic mains, but I'm giving Ballistic an E tier. I think Ballistic is a very team-based legend, where you're going to get way more value out of them if you're actually playing well around your team. But if you're someone who solo queues Apex a decent amount, then you probably have learned already that your teammates most of the time are not very good at the game. So running a character like Ballistic who's very team-based around teammates who aren't doing that much, and then on top of that, Ballistic has no movement abilities to get in and out of fights, you basically just have to hard commit and hope you win, and if you don't, it's over. He's kind of just an all or nothing type of legend, and if you're solo queuing, I just really would not recommend running Ballistic unless you want to have a really hard time. Here's a quick final look at all of our legends we have done so far in the Assault class before we move on to the next one, Skirmisher. Now, starting off with Pathfinder as our first Skirmisher, we are giving Path an A tier. Currently, with the way Ranked plays out, it is basically just teams fighting until someone makes an opening, and then it's all just basically movement characters that close the gap immediately. And there's almost no legends in the game that are better than Pathfinder at closing gaps. And on the flip side, if you're the team who's losing the fight, Pathfinder's grapple is insane for getting out of fights and running away and maybe trying to get a reset later. Not to mention, after his change to a zipline where you take 50% less damage with it with the purple perk, I've noticed it is actually almost impossible to die when you're taking Pathfinder's upgraded ziplines. Path is a great legend for rotating, great for fighting, and great for running away and trying to salvage a game where it's not looking good for you. On top of that, you get the flexibility of hitting ring console or recon depending on which you choose, and that's more Evo shield for you. All in all, definitely one of the most flexible and best legends of solo queue ranked. Next for our skirmishers, we have Wraith, who I am giving C tier because she's kind of just a product of the times. Where when Apex was newer, she was definitely an S tier legend, but as the game progresses, her team utility just isn't really the greatest anymore. And the only reason why I would see you wanting to run Wraith as a solo queuer is just because you have a little bit better of survivability. The problem with Wraith though, is if you're trying to queue away or use your Wraith phase, it is very easy for any other movement legend in the game to catch up to you where they can just shoot you coming out of your phase and you don't even get to use your gun. And with the portal, it's the exact same scenario. You can sit there and place the portal and go really far and fast with it, but once you put it down, anyone can take it too. Her only real strength in the current times is basically off-angling, but there's a lot of legends in the game who I would say can just do that better now. She's genuinely just not that good of a legend at the moment, and the only reason why we see so much of her is just because a lot of big content creators play her. Moving on to Octane, which is where we get, in my opinion, another E tier legend. Whether we are talking solo queue or 3-stacked, Octane is genuinely just pretty useless, and he has been for a few seasons at least. It is very easy to kill a team taking an Octane pad. The pad actually has very loud audio now. It's one of the few things in the game that you can actually hear. He's in the Skirmisher class, which is arguably the worst class in the game. And he has a movement ability where he is the only legend in the game to have a movement ability that actually punishes him for using it. Meaning when you use your stim, you lose HP. No legend in the game really actively punishes you for using movement like Octane does. In terms of solo queue, I would not run him purely because you really don't offer anything to the team when you play Octane. On to Revenant though, and this is no shock to most people I would imagine, but this is our first S tier legend of the video. Personally, I would say Revenant has the best movement ability in the entire game, while also being one of the hardest legends in the entire game to fight. When you combine an ult that gives you a free 75 shield that can refresh itself upon knocks, combined with the best movement ability in the game arguably, it just makes for not a fun time to fight. But I will say as a solo queuer, it makes for a great legend to play to actually gain RP. Whether you did big damage and you're trying to close a gap super quickly, you have a great ability for doing that. Or if you need to run away from a fight because it's clear that it's already lost or you think you're gonna lose. The only character in the game who I could say could maybe catch a Revenant would be a Pathfinder, and that's at the cost of a grapple and maybe a Pathfinder zipline too. On top of that, even with Revenant's passive, you could get into some crazy rat spots or just get into height immediately for an advantage in fights. I think Revenant's very versatile, and if you're a good player at the game who's also good at Revenant, you will pretty much absolutely destroy lobbies if you're playing him smart. That being said, by the time I release this video, I really hope Revenant gets nerfed. Now with our next skirmisher, Horizon, this is a legend I'm giving C tier surprisingly. And it's just because I feel like Horizon is kind of more team oriented. And out of every legend in the game, she probably got the worst perks. And I would even argue with the addition of Alter to the game, that Alter's tactical is a good alternative to Horizon's tactical. Overall, I feel just in terms of solo queue, not really that useful, and you don't really have any getaway abilities to help you live either. But in terms of pure fighting power, Horizon is still not bad, and that's why I'm giving her C. Moving on to Velk, unfortunately, I am giving Valkyrie a D tier, and I wish I could give her higher because I liked Valkyrie meta the most in all of Apex. But I feel it's hard to find a scenario where you really need a Valkyrie on your team when evacs exist at the moment. I would say her jetpack is just kind of average at best for repositioning during fights, and there is so many better tacticals in the game for controlling the pace of what's happening around you that I don't really even see a scenario where you really would say Valk's tactical is a game changer. In terms of solo queue, I just feel like you have way better options. Now with our last legend in the skirmisher category, we have Alter, who I gave a B tier. Now I actually feel like Alter is pretty solid because you have an ability that can make all three of your teammates escape a bad situation, given at the cost of a little bit of a wind up period. And like I said before, I feel Alter's tactical has kind of replaced Horizon's tactical. So I feel Alter has really kind of given you a good flexibility between being a offensive legend, but also having a good getaway at the same time. I don't exactly think she's insane for solo queue, but I definitely think there's way worse legends in the game you could be playing over her. So with that being said, this is a final look at our skirmisher legends before we move on to recon. On to the recon category, starting with Bloodhound, who I have in B tier. Now, honestly, I feel the most important thing for gaining RP as a solo queuer is running legends who have survivability. But Bloodhound, I'm kind of making an exception for, just because Blood's ability to get info for your team is so good, combined with the recon passive, where I feel it's hard to put them any lower. I personally have noticed that my teammates tend to do a lot better when there is a Bloodhound on the team just because they have info to work with and they don't have to rely on their game sense. Not to mention Bloodhound is also just very good in the meta with how many Bangalores there are, and Bloodhound is basically the only solid counter to Bangalore smokes. And as long as you have your ultimate, you actually have a pretty good chance of running away if you have to. So in terms of solo queue, probably the best recon legend. Moving on to Crypto though, and this will be the last E tier of the video. And I tried to put a lot of thought into Crypto to really feel if this was accurate for him. And I feel pretty confident now that I just can't see a scenario where a solo queuer would ever want to play Crypto. Crypto is a very slow-paced character, meant more for the competitive side of Apex. So he kind of just really doesn't fit ranked at all in general. But on top of that, if you lose your drone, you also lose your ultimate. If your teammate dies, sure, you could use your drone to grab banners, but why not just run a support character instead who's better regardless? And aside from EMP, you really don't offer anything to the team because the drone is just way too easy to destroy mid-fight to make the wall hacks useless, and then you have to wait another like 40-second or so cooldown. Crypto is too slow paced, he has no movement abilities, and his support character is better for banners than his drone is. So all in all, I don't see why you would ever play Crypto and he gets an E. Now with our third recon, we are on to Seer, and it's going to be a D tier. I feel Seer is pretty straightforward, I don't need to say much here. He has been nerfed very hard compared to what he once was, and right now if you're going to run a recon legend, you should just run Bloodhound and not Seer. Especially because Bloodhound actually has a better chance of escaping fights if it comes down to it. On top of that, with Bangalore being so strong, you would much rather run a Bloodhound than a Seer. Really don't have much to say on this one. And for our last recon, we have Vantage, who I'm giving C. Surprisingly, normally I would give Vantage even lower. But I feel as a solo queuer, you have at least a decent movement ability, and then you have an ult where you can grease people in third party without actually having to commit to it. I feel the real problem with Vantage is her sniper is just very bad later on in the game when the ring is really small. And I would argue that she has one of the worst movement abilities out of all the legends in the game that do have movement. I don't exactly think you're throwing to play Vantage, but I just think you have better options. Now here's the last look at all of our recon legends on the tier list before we move on to what I would say is the best category of class for ranked, which would be the support class. The reason why the support class is so good in ranked, especially for solo queue, is because you have the option to craft teammates banners. I would say at least 50% of your games will involve your team dying at some point or you dying and your teammates having to run away to go craft a banner. So with that being said, regardless of even if I put a legend in here low in the tier list, at least having one of them on the team is very important. So starting off with Gibby though, I am putting him in D tier. And the reason why I'm doing this is because Gibby, I would say, is probably the most team-oriented legend in the entire game. Meaning Gibby can be really good if your team is solid, but Gibby will also be horrible, I feel, if your team is not good. Gibby is not really a character that you can play and carry your team with or get out of fights if you have to. You kind of live and die by his dome. And now that Gibby has been out of meta for so long, I highly doubt that any of your randoms are going to remember how to play around a Gibby bubble. Not to mention you have a giant hitbox and you're very easy to kill. I feel like Gibby doesn't really have any carry potential, and he also doesn't really have any means of getting in and out of fights quickly. Definitely would not recommend running him out of all the support characters if you're solo. Moving on to Lifeline though, we have her in B tier, which if this was not solo queue, she would probably be A to S. But this is a solo queue tier list, so she's losing a little bit of points because she doesn't really have any means of escaping. But in terms of resetting very quickly to prepare for next fights, and then even just applying a lot of pressure mid-fight if your teammate gets downed, and making enemies enemies have to come fight you because you're rezzing passively. She's definitely one of the best support legends even in terms of solo queue. Her downside is you definitely have to commit to fights, but as long as you're making sure you are not the first one to go down as you're playing Lifeline, you are going to do a lot. Next, with Mirage, this probably will be no shock, but we have Mirage in D tier. Mainly because his revive is just a worse version of Newcastle and Lifeline for the most part. If you're gonna run anyone in the support class, there's definitely better options than Mirage, without a doubt. And for the most part, I feel it is pretty easy to tell which Mirage is the real one when you're fighting him in his ult. And I would just say the tactical is useless. Maybe even Mirage mains would agree with me on that one. I think he definitely just needs a new tactical. I think it's not good. And for our fourth legend in the support class, this is, in my opinion, the #1 legend in the game for gaining RP solo queue, and that is Loba in S tier. Loba is literally everything you would ever want as a solo queue ranked player trying to win. She is on the support class, which is basically a must-have solo queue. She has a really good movement ability for taking off angles, height, or running away, which this movement ability can also be upgraded twice if you want to use both your perks on it to make it even better. And you have a black market to help your teammates get loot, so maybe they spend less of the game looting and more time actually trying to fight, so you have better armors for the end game. In my personal experience, Loba has been the easiest legend in the game to gain RP consistently with without queuing with teammates. I promise you guys, if you're struggling to gain RP, give Loba a try. I promise if you guys are solo queuers and ranked and you're struggling to gain RP, give Loba a few games to see how it goes. Now onto our last two support legends, starting with Newcastle, who I feel personally is the best support legend in the game, but this is not with solo queue in mind. For solo queue, I'm putting Newcastle in B tier because I feel he is still a very solid character, and he's one of the 2 support characters in the game who actually have some form of escape ability, and he's very flexible with being able to fight well inside buildings and outside in the open. Newcastle's big drawbacks really are the fact that he's definitely a more team-oriented character, and I would argue that he probably has one of the highest skill gaps in the entire game. So if you don't already know how to play Newcastle very well, I feel you're going to be a detriment to your team. So if you're a Newcastle main, then I would say go ahead and run him in ranked and you'll probably do very well, but otherwise I would stay away from him. And lastly, we have Conduit, who is also in B tier. And this is purely because even though you do have to commit to your fights with Conduit for the most part, it's undeniable that she has a lot of power mid-fight. And I would say the people you're fighting, if they don't have a Conduit, you actually have a comp advantage, meaning the legends you are running are making the fight just a lot easier for you, and Conduit, I feel, fits into that category. So if you like to get more up in fights and don't care as much about running away, then Conduit's probably one of the best options you can have. So there is all our support legends, and with my opinion, this class holding the best solo queue legend in the game. Moving on though to our last class is the controllers, and we have Caustic, Watson, Rampart, and Catalyst. And I am gonna include Caustic, Watson, and Rampart together to make this a little easier and put them all in C tier. They all fill very similar roles, and the only time I feel you would see major differences in what these characters do would be competitively and not in solo queue ranked. They aren't exactly very flexible characters, but if you have any of these ones and manage to make it into endgame, you will be very glad that you have a controller legend in endgame. At best though, they're all just very good at stalling out pushes and helping you reset a little more by stalling out people from trying to push you after you just fought. I would say overall though, if you want a controller legend on your team, you should go with Catalyst, who I put above a tier in B, and that's just because Catalyst does what the other controllers do to a similar extent, but with her ult, she actually has a little more flexibility, and her ult was meant to be more aggressive and for rotating. And that right there is where I would end the tier list. If you made it this far, then you would see a big reasoning behind what I rated people is, do they have good movement, and do they have good survivability? Those are definitely the 2 most important things when it comes to solo queuing ranked. So regardless of what you took away from this tier list, I would at least keep that in mind when you are picking who you want to play, unless you're dead set on a certain legend. And if you disagree with anything, you're more than welcome to. This is all just my personal experience.